My name is Max Gagliardi, and this is the Talk Energy Podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app, leave a review, help me out. This episode's guest is Mark Nelson. Mark is the managing director of Radiant Energy Fund, and he formerly worked with Michael Shellenberger at Environmental Progress. Mark also has an Oklahoma background and is from Oklahoma City and went to my alma mater, Oklahoma State, and ran cross country, then heading off to Cambridge to get a master's in nuclear energy. Mark is a passionate nuclear energy advocate and has recently been featured on Bloomberg and other media outlets talking about the Ukraine-Russia situation and the impact on Ukraine's nuclear power plants. This episode, Mark gives a brief history of nuclear energy. We talk about the misconceptions that the public has about nuclear power and where those fears stem from. And lastly, we debunk the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we talk about how nuclear energy is going to be one of the optimal energy sources to power human progress. Hope you enjoyed the show. Mark, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here, Max.
Yeah, we follow each other on Twitter, and I ran across Spaces last week, and man, you were like a super popular guy. All this crazy nuclear stuff going on with the power plant in Ukraine last week. How's the last kind of 7 days been going?
Max, it's crazy. I haven't even stopped to reflect really. And you know what's especially weird is that popularity is not coming from being wild or showy or anything like that. It's the opposite. Yeah. We have a level of anxiety over the Ukraine crisis that is off the charts.
Sure.
But not necessarily on the things that maybe it should be, or people are really upset in ways that have nothing to do with the risks that are actually facing Ukrainians, much less people outside of Ukraine. So I've been a calming voice. People have said, oh, you're so calm. Well, to just explain what is going on at the nuclear plants and what it means in a calm voice, even if I'm talking about potential future meltdowns.
Yeah.
It sounds completely different from the people whose goal is to stoke the fear.
Sure.
Or to spread the fear for clicks or for Twitter impressions. But I think that that's the reason the popularity's there. Just because I'm not losing my cool, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm guilty of it too. I remember when that thing happened last week. I was like, like Russia attacked a nuclear plant, and then it's like that's probably not a responsible thing to tweet. But I like that you were bringing like a way more nuanced and level-headed thing, just voice to the conversation. And I want to dive into all that stuff too and talk about nuclear broadly. It's been a topic that I've wanted to do more content around. But I noticed like when we first started, I first followed you on Twitter, I noticed at Oklahoma State background. Is that right? We really don't know each other that well, but maybe give me and the listeners some of your background.
Sure. I'm from Oklahoma City, went to Putnam City High School, and my whole life I wanted to go to MIT. After seeing it on a family trip and just knowing that was the place for a young Oklahoma nerd like me, MIT. So before I left Putnam City High School, I discovered that boarding schools existed, and I blackmailed my parents, twisted their arms until they let me go. So I went off to a really prestigious, really tough boarding school in New England. And instead of being from Putnam City, where my teachers are like, oh, he's great, MIT, you should take this homegrown kid from our school. I'm going to a boarding school where they're like, yeah, if you're going to take some kids from our year, Mark, he's not really our top choice for you. So because I only wanted to go to MIT, and I didn't apply to Harvard. Yeah, no Ivies. I didn't apply to like Vanderbilt's and University of Illinois. So even the big famous state school, the public Ivies or Michigan or Virginia, nothing. Didn't even finish a Stanford app. So what that meant was my parents were freaked out, like, wait, he's not going to college? And the default was to just go to where my brother was, my cousins were, my uncle and dad and granddad had all went. So I'm a runner, and my parents just were said, you can't take the family car out to go running at Lake Hefner until you finish an OSU app. And the sun was getting down, and I needed to get out and get my training run in, so I just threw my little OSU app in, and that's the only university that I had admission to. That's
weird because it's the only university I applied to as well. But my thing was more like I didn't have I don't know what I think I had like some kind of misplaced sense of cockiness where I was like, it doesn't matter where I go to school, I'll be fine. And just, and I had like, I'd grown up in Tulsa and then I moved to Oklahoma City and I had some friends, my older friends from Tulsa were going to Oklahoma State. And I really didn't put much time into, it's admirable that you had like a really big, ambitious college goal when you were younger because I just couldn't. I was, thinking about other things. I just was like, yeah, whatever.
I'm
I'll
so
get my
lucky
degree.
though, Max.
Yeah. What do you think about
look,
going to Stillwater and OSU? I have fondness for it. I really enjoyed it, but just your thoughts on being an alumni.
Well, I was there in a golden era. Moneybags, T. Boone Pickens was just pouring wealth into the school, and I was a direct beneficiary in a lot of ways. For example, when I was there, our sports went from a little regional thing to being one of consistently the best programs in the nation at a lot of different sports.
Sure.
For example, we'd always had a good cross-country program at OSU. It was one of the OSU sports that had won a title back in the 50s. But when I was there, we got a coach who's going to be legendary by the time he retires, not at Oklahoma State, but in the nation, who built the Alabama of running in Stillwater, and I was able to be on the team. So how do you replicate that?
Yeah.
I got so lucky mistakenly going to OSU in many ways. Here's another one. Russian language studies were nearly dead. So many places in the US, right? Russia wasn't interesting anymore. All the cool Ivy kids are taking Chinese. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but at OSU, I was able to do my Russian degree at the same time as engineering because they were really flexible. They didn't care. I mean, it just wasn't a big issue. I was able to do both. And my Russian professors were magnificent. It was like 1, 2, or 3 students per course. It was like the very best of an elite liberal arts education environment, while doing really demanding state school engineering programs. And what I mean by demanding state school engineering programs is because, first of all, engineering studies are pretty standardized across the nation.
Sure.
There's not that much difference. There's so much material to learn that's required nationally for each engineering discipline that the actual scope of changing it up at MIT versus OSU it's more of like slight differences in interest in professors or the motivations of your peer or whatever. At Oklahoma State, you have to work your ass off, and the engineering professors, they went to Stanford or Berkeley or MIT or Caltech. There's no real difference there, except that in OSU, full professors still are very proud and very concerned with undergrad teaching, and they become institutions. And it's every year I've gone past my time at OSU, I've appreciated that more.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of cool things about the school, and we don't have to make the whole podcast about it, but I thought that was an interesting connection that we had. And so then all this stuff last week, and I'm glad you came on, but walk me through, from OSU to what you're doing today, and then fill listeners in on what you got going on, and then we'll start diving into nuclear stuff.
Well, sure, Max. The path is oil and gas. That's what my family's business is. My family background is in oil and gas. I went to Oklahoma State that did have geology, T. Boone Pickens School of Geology, and it had mechanical engineering and a very, very, very good chemical engineering program in aerospace, but no nuclear, right? But a gentleman by the name of W.W. Allen, former CEO and chairman of the board of ConocoPhillips, decided to set up what he wanted to be the greatest engineering scholarship in the world. And so he decided that 2 engineering students each year from Oklahoma State would get a 100% full scholarship.
Wow.
Very full scholarship to Cambridge University. We're talking better, in some ways, better support and both financially and organizationally than things like the Gates Cambridge.
Yeah.
Just for Oklahoma State engineering students. Then he made the decision, very bold, I haven't heard of something like this, decision that the scholarship should go to freshmen and high school seniors. In other words, it's a life development program. It's a talent development pipeline more than like a reward for best work at the end of your undergrad. There are pluses and minuses to that. We've had students win the scholarship, great kids who just didn't find their path in engineering and they needed to drop out of the program. We've had other people join and then go through 3 or 4 years of preparing and then take a path that wasn't Cambridge University. And then they have to sub in and grab a high performing senior or something, right? Well, anyway, that took me to Cambridge, and I'm sitting there looking up the master's programs. Cambridge had just months before I started applying, established a master's of philosophy, MPhil, in nuclear energy, which was a nuclear engineering program. They just wanted to add in economics and policy stuff, business school courses, stuff like that. So I saw it and I was like, whoa, nuclear. And then within a few minutes of reading about it, I was like, this is it. I'm done. I don't have to search for anything else my entire life. Here's something where it's the most powerful energy source in the world and we're barely using it. How those two things happen at the same time, the most powerful energy source and we're barely using it, that sounds like a battle. And I've been absolutely certain that was been the right path since the moment I did it. There have been a few rough spots where I'm like, do I need to take a job and other energy things just to survive while I return to nuclear? But from that moment, about 11 years ago, I knew that was kind of what I wanted to do.
That's awesome. Man, that's cool. And that you've got to, going to Cambridge is probably a pretty sweet experience. I never did any of the outside of Stillwater, but I imagine it was a good education. And then your, intuition or your desire to want to do nuclear, I think is admirable. A lot of people think because my background's in natural gas primarily, that I just sell my book all the time. And although I do sell my book, I try to tell people that, but I really am just an energy advocate in general. I want more energy. I think that we need more energy to flourish as people. And I think nuclear is if you game theory it out, that's where it's going to go. I think it has to, for a lot of reasons. And I think the first topic here is really just, you mentioned it's, probably the best energy source, but it's one of the least used, or we're using less than we should. How do we get to this point? Maybe give people, to rip off the title of Stephen Hawking's book, a brief history of nuclear, just kind of leading us to today. That's probably a loaded question, but go for it.
Let's start all the way back.
Okay.
Tens of thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands probably, depending on what the definition is that you use, we figured out that fire works.
Sure.
It works for certain things. Clears out brush, scares away animals into places you can capture it, makes meat, all sorts of things easier and safer to eat, tastier even. And then, so we had that, right? We discovered then things like flowing water for sending boats places. We discovered how to capture and use wind, how to grow things with the sun's power and save that energy as carbohydrates in storage. These are all things that we discovered with the same brain, more or less, that we have today.
Right.
Yep. So then let's get to modern times. Modern. We start to figure out things like how to use the energy in hydrocarbons radically more efficiently. We're talking 10x, 15x, 20x, 100x more efficiently than the first steam toys that the Greeks played around with, right?
Yep.
So we're figuring out engines and engine science, yeah? Then, physics and electronics really starts taking off. We figure out photovoltaic effect by the end of the 1800s. Not why it works. That was Einstein's Nobel Prize, but that it works. So we had our first photovoltaic panels before 1900. And we start getting further and further into the secrets of the atom. Yeah. So in the 20s, I believe it was the 20s, we discovered fusion. That is two small nuclei combine and release energy. And then late 30s, we discover fission, that large nuclei could split, releasing energy. Within months of discovering that fission even existed, we had our first mock-up test to try to get fission reactions going. Within months after that, we have our first self-sustaining critical reactor in Chicago under a sports stadium. Within months of that, we have plans, and we're building a reactor that was, I believe it was it was over 1,000 megawatts thermal power in the reactor. 1,000 megawatts thermal within 3 or 4 years of discovering that splitting the atom was even possible.
Right.
I don't think people have gotten their heads around how crazy that is. At that point, at the point that we had 1,000 megawatt thermal reaction, knowing about fusion was already more than a decade old. And fission had only just been discovered. And of course, photovoltaic and wind and everything else is so old. We've had so much time to adjust to the reality of other energy sources. One of the weirdest things I see is one of the lines that go around the anti-nuclear professionals. They say, fission is a outdated 20th century energy source. And I just have to say, what the heck do you think all your favorite energy sources are? It's all 20th century.
Right.
It's just we stopped the 20th century. Here's the path we saw.
Sorry about that. It's coming through my computer for some reason.
No worries.
Turn this off. I can cut that out. Keep going. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you there. It's good.
Yeah. So what happens within a year or two of building this 1,000 megawatt thermal plutonium production reactor? Right? Dawn of the atomic age.
Right.
It's not, when I read about the nuclear bombings of Japan, what's interesting to me is how long it took for trauma to really set in about what that was. Not obviously for the people affected, but for the people affected, it was in the context of other bigger cities in Japan being burned to the ground with larger losses of life, right? So there were atrocities in a time of war all over Japan that, honest folks in Japan admitted they definitely would have done to us if they'd been able to, but we did it to them first and ended the war. So there was a gap of time between 1945 and 1947 where one country on Earth had nuclear weapons. During that time, you had the first intense stirrings of either a nuclear abolition movement or the nuclear bomb must be under the control of this new organization, United Nations. And that movement involved a lot of the scientists who had invented the nuclear bomb and felt responsible for its destruction and its power. They fundamentally distrusted a national government, a single nation's government having nuclear weapons. They thought that for people, mostly of the center or left, the political spectrum, were very uncomfortable with this nation state having that level of power. And that was the very birth of the political movement, the political pushback against nuclear. And I'm not saying nuclear weapons, I mean all nuclear. For what it's worth, the Soviet Union was very smart in pushing this as far as it could go because they needed time to make their own weapons, right? So they definitely pushed really hard on their foreign contacts and their foreign networks to try to get America to put its new weapon in control of the UN, where they thought they had a pretty good chance of heavily influencing the direction of the development of that technology. As it was, they were also developing their own, as would several other countries. And we ended up with a situation where if you thought that a world revolution was coming, like a communist revolution or a socialist, whatever, if you thought that a fundamentally new way of society was going to emerge beyond the nation state, the arrival of nuclear weapons quite obviously ended that vision. Ended the vision that had been going for decades. That someday there would be some global government beyond the small-mindedness and violence and cruelty of the nation state that would unite everyone in peace. All the workers would rise up. It sounds like I'm red baiting here. I'm not trying to.
Well,
at
I mean,
all.
it makes sense because now you have
people honestly held these beliefs and they really felt that it was good.
Yeah, and you had it makes sense because it would be broken though, because now you've got this level of sovereignty around individual nations that now can hold this power, right? This weapon. They're not going to be merged into one.
Exactly, right? So there's a really telling essay from George Orwell about this, where he said that We don't know how nuclear weapon technology is going to turn out. He said this, though. The age of battleships meant that you needed a powerful industrial nation to make the biggest battleships, and those could carry the biggest guns. But in an age of atomic weapons, what future do we have? He was very pessimistic. He said, if it turns out that nuclear weapons are really easy to make, no centralizing power can hold, and we're entering an age of violent anarchy.
It's weird because,
and he
like,
said, but if it turns out that nuclear weapons technology is hard like a battleship, but even harder, then we're entering a new age of despotism, where the conquering nation states that get this technology and don't share it with others will become the tyrants for all time. Okay, go for it, Max.
Well, I was going to say that it's interesting, though, around this, like, it creating you mentioned, like, there was this idea of this utopian kind of global order. But in a weird way, like with nuclear, it has the nuclear bomb specifically. Up until recently, with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, we had not seen like many destabilizing forces in the Western world at a level that we're seeing today. And part of that could be argued that some of this globalization has been driven by the fact that, you know, you've really kind of lost your incentive now for large nation states to go into these giant conflicts because there are nuclear weapons, which is like a weird game of chicken, like that, you know, everybody, you know, has sort of the gun pointed at each other. Therefore, nobody's going to make a move. Therefore, it creates some stability. And yet you now actually kind of almost have this globalized world, which we're seeing some cracks in that today with, because, maybe we're not.
Ukraine doesn't, wait. Ukraine doesn't have any nuclear weapons.
No.
Iraq didn't have any nuclear weapons.
That's true. But, you know, NATO and...
There's no war on the Korean Peninsula at the moment, is there?
Yeah,
why is that?
It's true.
I'm not advocating that. People hear me say that and they're like, "Oh my God, are you advocating for everyone to have nuclear weapons?" And I have to say, if I'm talking about nuclear weapons, it's too serious, too important for advocacy. Just describing. This is the world I see. If you have nuclear weapons, you may never win another war ever again. A war of expansion. Doesn't make you competent, doesn't make your army good at what they do, doesn't make your soldiers more motivated, doesn't make your generals skillful, doesn't make sure you don't have corruption in your supply chains for tires. All it does is mean that you really can't be invaded.
Yeah. Well, but we'll see.
That's it. That's what.
And like, it's interesting because I think what will play out. I mean, hopefully this conflict just gets over soon, and for all the humanitarian reasons and the world reasons, I hope it's done soon and it gets resolved. But if somehow Russia were to continue to expand, you know, is the threat of nuclear not really a threat if nobody at the end of the day is willing to use it? Like, what if Russia, like, is there a bluff that could be called where it's like, I don't know if we're going to answer this question now, but the point is like, if someone actually kind of finds out, wait a second, like, just because everybody has nukes doesn't mean they're going to use them, because once one person uses them, it's like this zero-sum game, right? And so therefore there are no nukes because they kind of, it's like two negatives, right? They cancel each other out. I don't know. It's getting kind of philosophical, but
you're approaching one of the deepest paradoxes of humanity, where if we knew that no one would actually use them, it would no longer work as deterrents, and somebody would do something stupid and it would get used. Here's a stronger way to put it. Very interesting PhD thesis by a friend of mine at Cambridge the same time I was there, but he was in international relations and game theory and stuff like that. I have relatively low regard for that, but very high regard for studying history, studying languages, talking to a lot of people, and writing interesting things. I don't need the academic formalism. His point was, if every country got rid of nuclear weapons, and you could actually confirm that all countries have gotten rid of nuclear weapons, a cataclysmic military and political advantage accrues to whoever cheats first.
Yeah.
So you have a very unstable situation where the rewards for cheating, the rewards for rushing in and being the first to have them again, or to hide them and not ever actually get rid of them, are so immense. I mean, you could recreate the experience of America in 1945 in September, right? The only country with the most powerful weapons known to man. Even though we used both of them that we had, they were gone then. But you see my point, Max, where you have this paradox that you touched on, where if you really knew that no one would use it, it no longer works as actual deterrence. It's the ambiguity and not knowing that acts as the deterrent.
Right.
And here's another one. Here's another one. You can never prove that we won't. No one could ever prove that we won't, and nor can you ever get rid of just the knowledge it's possible. Even the phrase, you reset so many areas of science and technology, the knowledge, stuff is made of atoms. Atoms can split and make a bomb. That knowledge is enough for human intelligence to recreate what we've already done. Much faster than not knowing it in the first place.
Yeah.
So there's no way to get rid of it. We're gonna live with it. The question is, are we gonna have the energy?
Yeah, well, that's what...
Gonna have the bombs. Those are here.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where I'm interested in understanding...
Are we gonna have the energy?
Understanding...
Which brings us to the next stage of our, 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah, keep going on that. Sorry.
Okay. So now we have a world where we're rushing as fast as possible into nuclear energy research, at the same time that governments are rushing as fast as possible into nuclear weapons research. You know, almost every country that had nuclear energy research was also doing nuclear weapons research. Many of the European nations with nuclear today had nuclear weapons programs that got fairly far along. I think people forget it, but on both sides of the debate, anti and pro-nuclear energy, forget that nuclear energy programs and nuclear weapons programs were not necessarily mixing staff, but they were under the same governments because they were seen as the same life and death issue. The defense and the energy were seen as the same because anyone who had been involved in World War II knew that intuitively. It's only 2 weeks ago that world leaders started remembering it again, that energy and defense are really closely related. Certainly, Germany didn't remember it until 2 or 3 weeks ago, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
And they still haven't accepted the lessons. We'll see. But now you have a moment where if you're trying to stop whatever political project seems behind nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, you can see them as the same thing. You try to stop them both. The fear of the nuclear weapons was going to be there and was going to grow regardless. The use of that fear and of radiological contamination to stop nuclear energy, that came later. The public did have to be trained that nuclear power plants were just as bad as nuclear bombs. The same thing. And what's the connection? Radiation. For example, radiation in babies' teeth. So California is the source of a lot of innovation. One of the most important innovations for shaping the next century was that California really pushed ahead in how to scare people about nuclear energy. It didn't stop there from being nuclear bombs at all, no. But it eventually was very successful when it combined with a few other cultural movements that are worth mentioning in the late 60s and 70s. Here's one. You have a generation of young people who are either baby boomers themselves or too young in World War II to really have to make big decisions or understand the weight of two bad choices that have to be decided between, right? Or you default to a worse third. So that generation grew up in a time of increasing abundance and the appearance of the decline of natural space and the rise of industrial pollution, all sorts of things that you can really start to pay attention to once you're rich enough. Once you have enough energy, you can start complaining about energy. If you don't have enough energy, it's very hard to complain about energy.
That's a theme.
Right? So you have a generation that sees these stodgy old World War II vets getting into middle age with their unspoken traumas and their weird obsession with making sure that even if you protect nature, there's enough energy. So that's old Sierra Club, shall we say. And the new Sierra Club is like against the war, for saving nature, against capitalism or imperialism, or you didn't have to be a communist or socialist sympathizer to fall into this position. All you had to do is say, we've got to protect nature and the natural world from development. And at that point, when you combine that with one other important strain that's always been there, always been around is the fear of too many people eating you out of house and home. Malthusianism. The idea that the population bomb, which was a direct reference to nuclear bomb, right? Saying that just as nuclear bombs can kill us all, the population bomb can kill us all, right? Yeah. So you had Malthusianism. You had panics about resource scarcity from that. You had political concerns about nation states. And then you had biological obsessions and purity obsessions that are triggered by contamination, where nuclear weapons tests, by definition almost, are able to spread in tiny, very, very, very trace quantities of radiation around the whole Earth. A lot more at the test sites, a lot less around the world, but it's there. And because radiation is so easy to detect, I mean, you can get out a radiation detector and detect it in your fireplace mantle, in your friends, in your coat. Like you can just find a lot of radiation if you want. Not, it's not a lot, but it doesn't matter. You can make a beeper go beep, beep, beep if you want to. You had something that was around you. You could always make panic on. You could always tell people they're being affected and hurt by, and you can tie their bodily health towards stopping nuclear energy and stopping the population bomb. And no matter what your neurosis was, no matter what your source of pessimism was about the world, you could be brought into a movement to stop nuclear energy.
Yep.
Now, the idea was you could stop nuclear bombs too. That failed, but it didn't matter. To the people who were trying to stop both, it scarcely mattered that their success was only on the nuclear energy. That movement turned into what we now think of as the main climate movement, which is why they're willing to sacrifice almost any climate or humanitarian objective to stop nuclear.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Because their roots, their most influential people, and a lot of their funding sources come from stopping nuclear. They've only tried to stay relevant by adding on carbon.
It's crazy. Yeah, I'm curious about that. Is that really the origins of was stopping nuclear? I'd not heard that before.
Yeah, so for a while, the environmental orgs stayed away from climate change because they're like, that's just something that the nuclear companies are saying to make people think that nuclear is better than coal. You see how we've turned around? Like, well, it's insane when I show that to people. You still have like local Sierra Club chapters and stuff who fight nuclear, saying we have enough energy, implying whatever you have is good enough. And if that's coal, they're for coal as long as it's against nuclear. Yeah. They were for gas as long as they were against nuclear. And then you have like the actual, some people, not me, go a lot more into figuring out who's funding who, where's the money coming from. Like, we've just seen that an organization funding a lot of work from NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, and others was coming from Russia, like this organization Sea Change, which I ran into a few times when I was in San Francisco, and I was like, can't really figure out what they do. They don't really say much on their website or whatever. It turns out they were putting millions into the groups that we were fighting, who were fighting to shut down nuclear. And it turns out it's just Russia doing basic, like very clear, very reasonable subterfuge of American energy.
Right.
I get it. I really do. I think it was a very smart plan. I feel suckered that I took Americans at face value, that they really cared or had some real position against our nuclear plants. I feel like a big idiot when they were just corrupt traitors, you know? Like I didn't, because that's so much easier. And to see that the last few days and to see it in the context of the war, it's going to be a lot easier, I think, to help the public ignore them. And we're talking very big organizations, Max. Like NRDC, who keeps fighting to shut down nuclear plants, their budget's like $200 million a year. And it's not all Russian money, of course. Like Jeff Bezos gave him $100 million a few years back. So like, no, Jeff genuinely does not give a toss about nuclear. He does not care, according to people close to him. He's just like, he gives his money to people to distribute, and he's like, do whoever's standard. He's very pragmatic. He doesn't have time for it. It's not a concern. He doesn't care, right? Elon's now fully pro-nuclear. Really excited to see what happens with that transition. He's always been not afraid of nuclear, but he wasn't always for it, which is an important distinction. There's the fear, and then there's being for it. Those are often two different things. even if they're combined. They're combined very rarely. There are people who are both afraid of it and for it. The Brits are very interesting in this regard. And I think it does have something to do with them still being a nuclear weapon state. By the way, this is very unpopular chat. Like, people hate it when I bring this up, both inside and outside the industry. But here's my honest experience. If you have somebody scared of nuclear waste that's never hurt a fly, then it's not because of nuclear waste. You got to figure out what's driving them. And it tends to be nuclear war and unprocessed feelings about their own mortality and their own legacy. That's it. And you can't get there by sometimes you can get there by showing, hey, I'm Mark. This is me walking and hugging nuclear waste. Here's me in a beautiful waste facility built by the Dutch that welcomes school kids for tours. They have a museum of radiation there. It's so beautiful. If you're in southern Netherlands, go check it out. And then that's enough that people are like, okay, I get it. I'm not afraid now. But a lot of people, the fear is, and the target that they think that fear is going towards, the nuclear waste, it's just because they haven't really struggled with what it means that they're going to die someday.
It's crazy. Like, all these themes seem to tie together in a weird way. Because I'm in oil and gas, I feel like we're maligned by similar forces that have tried to, deflect a lot of the positives and benefits that can be brought forward through the use of different types of energy technology. And one thing that I see with all these nuclear reactors getting shut down or shuttered is that it's the clear opposite of what the world seems to be saying that they want, which is to reduce carbon. Yet we're sitting here, shutting down massive sources of energy that can do just that can reduce carbon. And it's the same with like natural gas. It's like, look, the reason why we've displaced a bunch of coal and, we've reduced a bunch of CO2 is to switch to nat gas. And some of that was top down through the regulations on coal plants, but a lot of it was just because, like, we had a bunch of it and it made sense and it worked. But yet, I saw a study the other day that said if we if we started getting aggressive on LNG export and import around the world, we could do a lot more to reduce CO2 than electric vehicles. And, people were just shutting that. That's not even a talking point. And it just reminds me a lot of nuclear, right? It's like, if we really want to do these things that everybody says that we want to do, it seems like nuclear is just kind of the no-brainer. So let's just talk about the FUD, like the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You've talked some about the origins of this, but why is it all wrong? Why is the fear, uncertainty, and doubt incorrect about nuclear?
Okay, so I like to go straight to Chernobyl.
Okay.
Chernobyl nuclear plant had a massive explosion, by far the worst nuclear disaster ever. And then they stabilized the fire, recruited hundreds of thousands of people to go in shifts to clean it up, and they kept operating the power plant. They kept operating. Yeah. Chernobyl kept operating. In 1986, there was the giant disaster. In 1987, they exceeded the previous year's electricity supply. In 1988, they beat that year's. In 1989, they beat that year's. In fact, the peak electricity generation from Chernobyl nuclear plant wasn't reached until I think it was 1990.
Wow.
The plant stayed on until 2000.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I mean, the total amount of electricity ever generated by Chernobyl nuclear power plant, of which most was after the accident, is an amount that's not far away from all the power ever made by German solar panels. And if they'd kept it on, there'd be no comparison.
Yeah.
Right?
So that was like the beginning of all this.
So the worst nuclear disaster ever. The death toll was terrible. It was about 50 people. It shouldn't have happened. Divided approximately evenly between plant staff, first responders, and folks from the outside. So later responders and or local populations that suffered. Now, the fear, uncertainty, doubt death toll from Chernobyl, God, it's got to be in the millions.
Yeah.
Depending on how you want to divide up blame, Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster didn't get so much as a single person a radiation burn. Not one person. One person has now been declared legally dead from radiation from Fukushima Daiichi, but it was a gracious act by a well-meaning government. It was not science, per se. So we've got one. If you want to believe the legal process rather than the scientific process in Japan, fine. The death toll from shutting down all the Japanese nuclear, Japan wading in with its incredible buying power and buying up fossil fuels to displace it and burning those fossil fuels to sustain life. I'm not critiquing the burning of the fossil fuels if they insisted on turning off nuclear. That's the difference here. And whatever we think is going to happen with climate change, clearly you can just add that in if that's a concern of yours. The death toll from Fukushima Daiichi's triple meltdown is 0 or 1 on radiation, and it is vast on fear. But that fear had to be manufactured. Like, animals aren't afraid of Chernobyl radiation. And there's a lot of like competing scientific groups where some scientific groups are trying to show that there's slightly more tumors on the livers of this type of vole or something like that. But the place is just teeming with wildlife all the way up to alpha predators, right? So it's like, if you know an environmental risk by its fruits, nuclear plants surrounded by abundant life and nuclear disasters populated by high concentrations of wildlife say a lot to me, because in the end, people's weird neuroses should not be the basis of ecology. It should be, is nature doing really well? Is a lot of kill and be killed happening next to your nuclear facilities?
This idea around using Malthusian fear to control populations around ideas and ideologies, it's like one of the oldest things that, that's ever been around for humans. I mean, you talk about climate change. I mean, there's literally a story in the Bible about the earth getting flooded because people did the wrong thing, and this is a very ancient technique to scare people. And the reason why people do it is because it works. It works really, really good. Like if you say, hey, look, build this solar panel or this windmill or the world's going to die. Most people are just going to work every day. They're just trying to feed their family. They're not like doing the research on whether that's true or not, but they hear a statement like that, or that a nuclear plant's going to melt down and it could kill everyone. They're just like, well, you know what? I'm going to not, they don't even want to go there because it sounds so scary and there's so much fear that it is an incredible political and policy weapon to be able to use that fear. And it's really, really hard to combat because you have to have like a nuanced discussion to explain to people why that is not the case versus just a headline that says you're all going to die. And that is, that fear is really where I see a lot of the problems in energy around the world, and particularly with nuclear.
So let's get to the next stage. Why folks our age are coming back to nuclear.
Love it.
We're just not scared. The young people who are truly and genuinely obsessed with and scared by global nuclear war tend to be the only people that I can't break through to in one-on-one, high attention, high specialization conversations, you might say, that's just for that one single human in front of me. I find that if I can't break through to them, it's they have a nuclear war obsession. Occasionally, it's people with direct business interests, but that's not very interesting to our discussion. Let's just assume almost everyone we're chatting to is in good faith. In bad faith, we either aren't going to make progress or there are other methods or other arguments, right? But assuming good faith conversation, what I found is that an obsession with nuclear war, which such a small fraction of millennials have, bigger fraction of Gen Xers, much bigger fraction of baby boomers, that obsession with nuclear war ends up actually doing more than blocking people from nuclear energy. It also affects the way they see doomsday from climate change occurring. They see climate change as being an apocalypse, like bam. Or they see climate change like a thing that's going to click and then everyone's going to be walking around suffering and dying. Like after a nuclear war. Like their model for how the world ends has just been easily adapted for climate change. And which is why in Manhattan you had baby boomers pay to put up some climate change clock where if we didn't do something in exactly 10 years and then 9 years and 364 days and then 9 years and 363 days, we're all going to die, right? And that clock is, of course, powered with electricity that is now exclusively fossil fuels because Why? Because they shut down the local nuclear plant that was the only real source of clean energy guaranteed for the city. But if you have a countdown clock of 10 years, you clearly have a way of thinking that doesn't care where electricity comes from. It's totally spiritual. It's like a cult doomsday clock, right? It's not scientifically valid, but it doesn't need to be, because these are people whose end of the world scenario is the same regardless of whether they think it's nuclear war or climate change. But us young people, we have an idea that climate change is going to make things harder, it's going to make the weather scarier, we're going to have crop issues over time, but it's not going to be like a bam, 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 suddenly 3 billion people are dead, which is the model in the heads of a lot of the climate doomer baby boomers. But there's the connection to the doomsday scenario from nuclear. You see? So that when you propose to them, wow, you've just said that you're so worried about climate change, it's the number one issue in the world. Let's not close our nuclear plant. And they're like, well, no, we're trying to stop doomsday.
Right.
You see how it all comes together? Then there's another thing that you can see where things that are good and bad clump. So there are good things and bad things. Carbon is bad. Nuclear is bad. Therefore, nuclear is carbon. Do you see? And that would have gone with, we heard earlier in our conversation, that's where some of the earliest fear and hatred for nuclear technologies came from. If empires are bad, if capitalism is bad, if war is bad, then that means nuclear is war. Nuclear is imperialism. Nuclear is capitalism. And the greatest nuclear state becoming the Soviet Union and its successor state, Russia, in terms of number of reactors under construction, number of projects around the world, skill of employees, like Rosatom really became the best. I don't know what's going to happen now with sanctions, but the Russian state atomic enterprise is the world's leader until a few weeks ago in nuclear stuff. And that has not changed the people, even the people who are, there's the so-called tankies who are like for Russia because it was the Soviet Union, because it was against capitalist empire. They haven't adjusted their thinking to think, okay, this group has the most number of nuclear bombs. They have the biggest obsession with nuclear technologies, and they're doing the most innovation and the most building. They still think that nuclear is bad because capitalism is bad. That means nuclear is capitalism or whatever, right? So I field a lot of inquiries from people who get into nuclear and they're like, I don't understand it. This group says they hate capitalism, but then they say nuclear is bad because private capital won't invest in it. Why is this? And I'm like, because that's not the level in which this conversation is happening in their head. Nuclear is a bad thing, which means it's like the bad things, which are capitalism. Renewables are good things, meaning if renewables require capitalism or use capitalism and you like renewables enough, it means it's good and capitalism is good for renewables. It's not some, people will like to say this is rational or irrational. No, I reject that. It's just a different senior goal in the head, in the heart, above whatever it is that nuclear would deliver. Prosperity, ending carbon increases, like that.
Let me ask you this. I get a lot of people telling me that nuclear is uneconomic and that it doesn't make any sense. And they suggest because of the long lead times and all the money that it costs to build new reactors, this is why it's uneconomic. And my intuitive response is, well, those things are all kind of central planner activities that have created these massive, lead times for permitting, all the bureaucracy and the red tape. If it were a world where you could just, none of that existed, would the economics, did they stand up a lot taller and brighter than they do in the current environment? Or just talk a little bit about the economics of a new reactor, because you're not seeing a lot of them getting built, and then therefore people point to it and say, well, yeah, they're not economic.
We could have a lot of fun with this one. Here's one way to start out. I hear from a lot of very smart, well-informed people, including people involved in finance, to say, nuclear, we don't need nuclear because it's cheaper to do today's wind and solar. And then you're like, well, but that can actually replace the function of nuclear. And they're like, aha, but then we'll have a nationwide supergrid by establishing a supergrid authority that will crush any state's objections and destroy any community objections and go straight through national parks if required. And we're going to then have 20, 30, 40 billion dollar offshore renewable super islands by abrogating any environmental rules, having nation states come in and make deals with each other. And you're like, wait, so when it's about stopping nuclear today, you're against, you say that it's because it's centralization and it's big authorities over locals or something. But then to replace the function of nuclear, you're implying we need to do something extravagantly more in that direction than even nuclear. But except it hasn't been tested and we don't know if it'll work for sure. Got it. And then you realize it's just they're against nuclear. They're not really like trying to figure it out. They're not trying to problem solve in nuclear. We're very fortunate right now that brilliant people are coming from around the energy world and the finance world now, this month, Max, to solve these problems rather than just crapping on them and running, which is what we've had till now. So that's the first thing I want to say. Here's the second thing. Almost no one understands electricity, including a lot of the electricity experts. They don't get it. They have really detailed images of it, like an artist painting a brilliant picture of a reciprocating engine, but not knowing what a diesel or an Otto cycle is. For your engineering audience, I think that'll be interesting. But like they can paint a very detailed picture, but they don't know like what's inside. Let me push on that a little more. The strongest critique I've received on Twitter for my technical threads for the public about why this or that is not an actual risk that's going to hurt you from Ukraine was this really detailed response saying, I don't trust this guy at all. He said that there are 20,000 fuel rods in this pool when in fact there are 20,000 assemblies, each one with 20 rods, meaning he was off by a factor of 20. So how can you really trust this guy? And this dude posted really detailed takedowns of various aspects of my wordings in 250 character tweets, right? And then near the end, he says, furthermore, he's completely wrong that natural air circulation is used to cool the nuclear waste that's in the dry storage. Instead, it's convection. I know this because I translated the documents. And I'm like, okay. This guy doesn't know that convection and natural air circulation are both the two different ways to describe this. And then you realize, he's not even he's a technical translator, as in he's an expert at translating technical documents, but without a physical understanding of the thing that has this great glossary for.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So we have a lot of experts like that in electricity who can describe an elephant, but doesn't know that there are such animals in existence because all they've had are images and anatomy books. Yeah. So this is the situation in electricity. Here, let me just say this puzzling phrase for your listeners. If they can figure out this phrase, they're a lot further towards understanding than most of our experts. Renewables are a cheap way to make expensive electricity. Nuclear is an expensive way to make cheap electricity.
That could be is that like a slogan somewhere? Or did you just make that up right now? Because that's really good.
No, it's back when I worked with Michael Shellenberger, who's just announced he's running for governor of California over at Environmental Progress. Yeah, yesterday. World moves fast these days, Max. Anyway, back to when I worked for him, he really pressed me very hard. Like, are you sure you can say this about these energy systems? Are you sure this is going to be correct in 1 year or 2 years, not just today? Are you sure we can state this? And sometimes I'd have to tone down his stuff and say, no, we don't have evidence for this. We can't say that. Although I believe it, we can't quote it. We can't cite it. We can't do a calculation yet. And then other things where it's like, okay, here's a very basic calculation to illustrate the principle. Be aware that you're going to be attacked because what's about to happen hasn't happened yet. That sort of thing. Yeah. So that phrase, renewables are a cheap way to make expensive electricity. Nuclear is an expensive way to make cheap electricity, came out of attempting to explain to him system costs, like ensemble costs versus component costs.
What's interesting
the
about renewables, and I've been researching more and more about energy stuff this last year versus where my historical disciplines have been. And it's like really this circular reference problem. It's the more, intermittent energy sources you introduce to a grid, the more the reliable sources are punished. So if you have a nuclear plant that is, can be extremely reliable, have very, very high uptime, create, from a point forward basis, once it is constructed, generate very cheap energy, that nuclear plant then gets hurt by intermittent sources of energy, which are subsidized through tax credits, renewables credits, et cetera. And therefore, it's like this: the more renewables we install, the more you reward kind of intermittent and or what I would call expensive energy, and you punish cheap energy, and it creates like a vicious feedback loop.
But Max, that could be solved in 24 hours from now. It's not a physics problem. It's just a grid priority. It's like electricity markets that are doing what you described were invented to kill nuclear plants. Like we came up with theories about running the grid a different way in order to break the spines of the entities that kept investing in expensive nuclear to make cheap power for their customers. So we divided the functions of investing in power plants, investing in lines, and like we split that apart in many regions of the Western world. We said it should be a market system to do this and that. I have really irritating conversations with free market people that I'm agreeing on almost everything, and then they're like, and we need a freer market on electricity. And I'm like, record scratch. Okay, don't know what you're talking about. The system that delivers cheap electricity service is not necessarily one you could even possibly arrive at through a market system. And if you think you're doing it, terrible surprises are likely to be awaiting for you, like in Texas. Texas thought it was better. Texas thought they were running the right electricity market. Texas thought they'd figured it out. And instead, they were just keeping costs low by racking up technical debt, regulatory debt. And they were handing incredible risks onto the customer. I don't necessarily excuse natural gas from this issue, and I certainly am upset that one of 4 nuclear reactors in Texas went down at the most critical time during the blackouts. But they could fix that, just quick changes to make sure the nuclear plants don't do that again. Everybody else can't do quick changes.
Well, and for nat gas, there's areas where I was going to say nat gas. There's areas where they don't have the freeze off issues. It's just the problem is Texas doesn't have the infrastructure weatherized in the way that they need to, because they usually don't get these like whatever standard deviation events that don't typically happen, right?
Sure. We don't have to go into Texas now. I know that's a whole kettle of fish itself. What I wanted to say is, if you change the electricity market rules, or how about this? Almost no renewable energy facility gets built without a power off-taker contract. Just give one to the nuclear plants, and then you're done. You're like, Max, you'd solve it overnight. It's that the same people who say we need really long-term contracting for renewables to build them out, like the Googles of the world, right? The Googles of the world could just go and give a contract to the nuclear plants, and that problem you said of the nuclear plants being hurt by renewables would be gone, because the nuclear plants would have a contract. Instead, it would be everyone else's problem to figure out how to use extra renewables if you had it, right? So the problem you described is technically sort of still there for someone, but the fact that it's fallen on nuclear plants is an intentional outcome of policy. Policy chose that. And then we get heavy energy users like Google who need power, how much? Round the clock. They have entire teams of nerds from the best schools, not even Oklahoma State. I love Oklahoma State, and I like it better than a lot of the schools that send people to Google to get problems wrong, to frame problems wrong. They have entire teams of people that are there just to figure out how you get steady carbon-free power. And when you ask them, won't you just get a power contract from a nuclear plant that's about to shut down so it doesn't have to shut down? They're like, no, it's better to do fossil fuels. Oh, okay. Thanks, Google. All right. And that's why we have the problem you said. It should be the renewables. It should be any other entity's problem other than nuclear, that nuclear plants are good at running full out. Instead, we say it's the nuclear plant's problem because we designed the system. And look, there's a way out. Expensive natural gas will make it not an issue. Some of the nuclear plants that have been most threatened by low natural gas prices are ones where the owner thought that they were going to make a bundle of money before the fracking boom by just entering these competitive markets and undercutting everybody. And then the gas came and undercut the nuclear, and they got outmaneuvered with gas prices going up. In fact, this is what I could say. I fought for a lot of subsidies. I don't want subsidies. I think it looks weak. I think it's not a good look. It's politically unpopular. It's very valuable to the consumer to subsidize a nuclear plant to keep it on, because that's how you get cheap electricity. Remember that the phrase? cheap electricity comes from a nuclear plant. And if you don't even have to pay to build a nuclear plant, you get a lot of value from subsidizing it to stay around. So that aside, I don't want subsidies. If we produce a lot of LNG, it will make pain for the American customer because the prices between Europe and America and Europe and Asia will get, the gap will get narrower. That will be very painful to America. It will save all the nuclear plants. I just think that there's better ways to save nuclear plants by just making it to where the competitive market is for everything that isn't a nuclear plant. Done. You're done overnight. For what it's worth, Canada basically does this. Ontario does. Instead, they just pay insane amounts of money to the wind and solar to turn off. And then people complain about the waste. Well, fine, the waste was there regardless. The waste was there in the destruction of the nuclear plants if you take away their revenue. When they're the only ones that can guarantee, or 99.9% guarantee, production during peak hours. Right.
Yeah, it's a complicated price. It shouldn't be as complicated as it is, but it does seem complicated. Could you replace the word nuclear in a lot of that, what you just said, with just baseload in general? It seems like it's all kind of under attack with the push for intermittent energy, or do you think nuclear specifics being singled out in some of these themes?
So you just asked me about the word baseload. I now try not to use it because it triggers a certain kind of energy expert that I think I'll be able to reach or learn from myself, as long as I don't use a word that's already become a culture battle in a very particular part of energy nerddom. So yeah, baseload. What do we mean by baseload? The original meaning was the lowest level of demand for a grid area or utility footprint over the course of a year. Meaning you never go below that demand, even though there are peaks and troughs above that level, right?
Yep.
So that was the original meaning of baseload, implying that it made sense to have at least the most efficient and largest, typically the same word, largest and most efficient power plants, the minimum number needed at key points on the grid to provide at least that minimum level, and then you use less efficient and more expensive sources above that level. Renewable people say that doesn't make sense anymore because that's the paradigm that they have to break to have renewables be the base, or not the base, but to keep expanding. So obviously, I think they want renewables more than they want any of the things they claim that renewables are going to provide, because they would be able to get a lot of those from nuclear, especially existing nuclear. But that's the reason I don't use baseload, because there is a war over the definition, and it's just easier. It's one fewer battle for me to fight to not use it.
Right.
Plenty of people still do, and I think that's fine.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this is interesting. I feel like we could do another episode, because I'm very fascinated with this topic. I've got a few things I got to stop here, but I want to continue maybe in the future at some point. This is it's just the nuclear thing, in my opinion. It just seems like this is the way that the world is going to have to go. I mean, let's face it, fossil fuels are a finite resource, and you will always have them. They'll just be more and more expensive over time. I mean, we've got, an almost unlimited amount. It's just how much money do you want to spend? We have thousands of years easily or more of fossil fuels, but how much money do you want to spend, and how much carbon?
That's rookie. How much? You've got thousands of years, Max. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
Right?
You got to boost that up. You want uranium, you got millions to billions.
Yeah, exactly. And how much carbon do you want to put in the atmosphere? And I'm not going to get into climate debate. I think it's a hell of a lot more nuanced than people make it out to be, but it's like religion, so I don't talk about it much. But
why risk changing the composition of the atmosphere if you don't have to?
No, you don't.
We're doing pretty well at this point. Why change it? That's my view.
And why not try to push towards more energy dense sources of energy that have less of an impact? I mean, whether or not, the world's going to burn up and we're going to lose all of our crop yields and there's going to be floods, that aside, why not move to more energy dense sources that don't pollute at all? People, the big FUD we didn't get into is the waste side of it. People point to that a lot. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that to me, I've heard is very, very a non-issue.
No, we covered it. We covered it as much as it needs to. This is the way I would put it. Your lifetime of high-level waste from high-level spent nuclear fuel, if we electrified everything, if we were making synthetic fossil fuels out of nuclear heat, if we were doing everything on the grid with nuclear energy only, and there were 10 billion people living really good lives, each person's energy for their life could be produced by the energy from an amount of spent fuel rods or whatever, that's about this big. It doesn't, you would have to store it in something, you'd have to transport. I mean, there are other complexities, but you'd have approximately this much nuclear waste from spent fuel to power your entire ultra high energy life. Yeah. So that's the waste issue. And no one's been hurt by stored nuclear waste. It's just not, it is very much fake news that is encouraged by a nuclear industry that wants it off their hands, partly because they're lazy, partly because they don't understand the public. All you have to do with nuclear waste is let people visit it, and then you solve the problem. It's done. When you don't let people visit nuclear waste, you make it seem like some dirty secret when it's boring. It's great. I love seeing it. It's inspiring. It's interesting to see nuclear waste. I tour nuclear waste whenever I go to nuclear facilities that have got it because I love it. It's the sign of a completed, almost a perfect energy source. You can just see the waste. It's so good. So we did cover it a little bit. I think that finishes it. Here's where I would leave it, Max. We did lots of storytelling. We did lots of history. We talked about lots of cultural trends leading all the way up until just about now. And if we did another episode, we could talk about the future.
Yeah, let's do that. No, I want to. This was great, Mark. Appreciate it. I love the Oklahoma connection, and it's fascinating stuff. It's conversations that need to be had more. And I don't know, there's probably not much more of an important conversation to have around energy than around nuclear. I think it's the conversation. So I am very, very happy that you agreed to come on. I will let you enjoy the rest of your Friday, and let's make it a point to do this again. Talk about the future.
For sure, Max. Thanks for having me.